From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. To lose one minister in the first 6 months of government may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose two starts to look like carelessness.
I just want to bring you now this piece of breaking news, which is breaking literally as I speak. And Kate McCann, our political editor, is here with that news. Kate.
Hi, John. Yes, in a very nondescript email just sent by 10 Downing Street in literally the last couple of seconds, we hear that Tulip Siddiq has officially left the government.
As the Economic Secretary to the Treasury and Anti-Corruption Minister was tendering her resignation, on the other side of town, the journalist who'd been responsible for investigating her was picking up the phone.
If my voice sounds slightly hushed, that is because I am in Waterstones on Gower Street. I was walking around town when the news landed, and owing to my steadfast commitment to the multimedia organisation that is our company,
Which we're very grateful for.
I've performed an 11th hour diversion, and here I am.
We hear from the journalist who pursued the story of Tulip Siddiq, her despot aunt, and the missing billions, on why she's stepped down now. The story today: the government's anti-corruption minister resigns.
My name is Gabriel Pogrund, and I am the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times.
Gabriel, within the last hour, we've just had the news that Tulip Siddiq has stepped down from her ministerial position. This really is a big moment, and it's something that you've been investigating for a while. Just tell us what we now know about Tulip Siddiq's resignation. What have we heard?
So it's a complicated story, and it's had a complicated end insofar as Tulip Siddiq has resigned as Economic Secretary to the Treasury, a minister whose role included countering financial crime and corruption. She's done so not because the independent ethics advisor to the Prime Minister found that she'd breached the ministerial code, but rather, she states, because she thought her abiding presence on the front bench would pose more of a distraction to the government than it would a benefit, which is shorthand for saying it was probably not tenable for her to keep on going after the drip of revelations over the last fortnight.
And the Prime Minister has said something very similar.
That's right. They are constituency neighbours and personal friends. He has said that there is a way for you to rebuild if you go now and take some time to re-engage with constituency matters on the backbenches for a while. But clearly in this instance it was becoming untenable for number 10 and indeed number 11, who have enough problems over at the Treasury right now and needed this like they needed a hole in the head.
And she has been the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, so this is a big part of the team. Gabriel, your stories have really shone a light on Tulip Siddiq. Just stepping back, starting with the political background of the woman in the centre of this, just remind us a little bit about who she is and who her family are.
So she's a member of this extraordinary dynasty, really. Her mother is a woman who in Bangladesh is known as Sheikh Rana. She was one of the two surviving children of the family of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. He was the founding father of the nation of Bangladesh when it secured its independence from Pakistan. He was a founding father and the first president of that country once it became independent in 1971. And he had a complicated legacy. He is sort of regarded as having secured the South Asian nation's independence, but also presided over the collapse of the economy and some very bloody human rights abuses. But he was shockingly assassinated alongside almost every member of his own family and various members of his household staff in Dhaka. And the only two family members who weren't present in the capital on this occasion were Tulip Siddiq's mother, Rana, and her elder sister, Sheikh Hasina. And Hasina later led the Awami League, the party founded by her father from exile and in due course served on 2 separate occasions as Prime Minister of the country. And her life story was defined by both the desire for revenge against the rogue military officers who had murdered her father and so much of her family, but also to preserve the father's legacy and re-establish the Awami League as a party of government in Bangladesh. And that is what she did, and she ended up following a similar trajectory to her father's, in that what had started as a party dedicated to democracy ended up being marred by allegations of human rights abuses, of violent recrimination against political adversaries. It led to a national uprising in which her own home was raided and ransacked, and she was compelled to leave the country by helicopter.
So it's quite the dynasty. You have the founding father who soon turns into an authoritarian leader. There's a military coup against him. Most of his family is assassinated alongside him, apart from the 2 daughters, Tulip Siddiq's mother and Sheikh Hasina, who becomes the prime minister. There's a lot of talk about the human rights abuses under Sheikh Hasina. Just give us a sense of what life was like for people. What is she accused of?
So there's a broad list of allegations: the enforced disappearance of regime adversaries and opponents, people being pursued politically, and when that failed, through violence and enforced disappearance in many instances. I mean, I think that the event which precipitated her demise was there was a groundswell of student dissent against this policy whereby those whose family had been involved in the country's independence struggle were given preferential treatment applying for civil service jobs, which might sound obscure, but was the source of much resentment. And she responded to these student protests by ordering the police to brutally quell the dissent. And so that is the basis of the accusation of which she stands accused now, of crimes against humanity, because as many as 800 people were killed.
800 people.
That's right. I've seen footage myself, having been out in Bangladesh last week, of people who were, in some instances, walking away from police being shot and then shot again in the most unfathomable and brutal way. And that was the last detail of her premiership, the sort of grim peroration to her 15 years in charge.
And Gabriel, almost in a sign of how close Sheikh Hasina is to her sister, to Tulip Siddiq's mother, it was actually Tulip Siddiq's mother who negotiated her resignation when she fled in a helicopter. Tell us about that.
That's right. A few days ago, I interviewed a man called Mahfouz Alam, who is a senior advisor to the current leader of the country, and he had this fairly vivid way of describing the relationship between Hasina and Rana. He said that Hasina did the politics and Rana took care of the family wealth and property, but their relationship was one of incredible closeness, and it was in the final days of her leadership that Rana ended up brokering her departure, representing her to both the country's powerful military, but also the government of India, where she has since fled. She actually got on the helicopter herself with Hasina in those final days. She was there getting the last helicopter out of Saigon with Hasina herself.
Wow, so they are incredibly close as a family. It's because of this moment last summer when Sheikh Hasina's administration completely collapsed. Her regime was gone. She fled the country, and suddenly a light was shone on her finances and the state of corruption in the country. At what point did Tulip Siddiq become a part of that story? How did her name come up?
So she started when she was named last month in a court filing produced by the Anti-Corruption Commission. And then it just led to a re-examination of her links with this discredited regime. The problem for Siddiq was, when it had been expedient for her to do so, she had historically sought to distance herself from this regime. When once asked to assist a British-educated barrister who had been subject to a enforced disappearance.
Our producer then attempted to get answers to questions.
I'm not Bangladeshi, and the person you're talking about, I have no idea about their case.
We're
That is
covering
the
that.
end of my statement.
She told a Channel 4 news reporter that she wasn't Bangladeshi. She accused them of suggesting she was, and then threatened one of the journalists who was pregnant at the time.
Thanks, Daisy, for coming. Hope you have a great birth, because child labour is hard. See you.
And later referred the broadcaster to the police, accusing them of racially aggravated assault. So she didn't take kindly to the insinuation that it would have been within her gift to do more to advocate on behalf of the victims of this regime, even as British diplomats at the Foreign Office said that she probably was the best link we had to Hasina, with whom she was close and who she had historically described as a great source of inspiration and as a great female role model. So she, on one occasion, I think, even said that she didn't talk to her aunt about politics, which was just increasingly implausible as the back catalogue was disinterred and re-examined. And last weekend, we revealed footage of her on BBC World in which she appeared as a representative of the party and her aunt on the BBC.
Well, I'm joined by Tulip Siddiq, who speaks for the Awami League. You're also the niece of the current Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina. You spoke to her an hour ago. What is she saying about what happened and why?
That's right. I did speak to my aunt an hour ago, and I spoke to her about the situation. She said...
She gave a very fluent account of a military insurrection/mutiny unfolding in Dhaka at the time. So it was just becoming very difficult for her to preserve the notion that there weren't awkward questions about her association with this particular regime.
And Gabriel, there's a particular picture, a photograph featuring Tulip Siddiq next to her aunt, Sheikh Hasina, who's in charge of Bangladesh at the time, and then a slightly unlikely third character, Vladimir Putin. And that photograph has become quite key in all of this. It's been doing the rounds. Just explain why.
So this was a official picture taken in 2013 when Sheikh Hasina, on a official trip to Moscow, visited the Kremlin to sign a nuclear power deal with Russia. Vladimir Putin was there, and so too was Tulip Siddiq, who now claims that she absorbed the mild inconvenience of flying all the way to Moscow because at the time she was unable to see her aunt as regularly as she liked, and so went there for social reasons. But this specific visit and her presence there has become the subject of much interest because the Anti-Corruption Commission in Dhaka says that Siddiq herself, as well as various members of her family, ended up benefiting through kickbacks and embezzlement from this scheme. So she always denied this idea that she had trousered money from it. And I should say, in the interests of fairness, that there was never any evidence that it was true. It did seem to be a act of recrimination from somebody bent on her and her family's destruction. Nothing so far to suggest it was accurate.
And the investigations that are taking place at the moment, do they have a sense of how much they think that regime, how much they think Sheikh Hasina, Tulip Siddiq's aunt, was responsible for siphoning off from the country?
Well, I'm trying all the time throughout this to be even-handed in acknowledging the turbulence of Bangladeshi politics and the rich history of one regime seeking to defame the other in the eyes of the country. So one has to take all these things with a certain pinch of salt. Nevertheless, there was a report, a white paper, which recently came out there, which said that $16 billion was being siphoned out of the country by the end. And separating, what a government states from the reality is important. But the reality is there's no doubt that there were a huge number of people connected to the regime who had these astonishing portfolios of assets. Transparency International, I think, says that Bangladesh under Hasina was one of the most corrupt countries on the planet, lower than Nigeria, Liberia, and Russia.
Gabriel, since there's been scrutiny on Tulip Siddiq, since her aunt lost power and these corruption investigations have begun, her housing situation and the housing within her family has come under particular scrutiny. Now, it's not often, as an investigative journalist, that you get to play estate agent come through the keyhole presenter, but I know you've looked into these. So tell us a bit about the houses in question and what we know about them.
So I'll try offer a fairly concise summary of them, but there are quite a few properties. Let's start with the home that Tulip currently lives in. That is a £2.1 million house in Muswell Hill in North London, which is actually owned by a man called Abdul Karim Nazim, who is a senior official of the UK branch of the Awami League and was appointed to a state-linked bank shortly after entering into a rental agreement with Tulip, who, I should say in the interest of fairness, says she pays rent consistent with market rates. That's property one. Property two is a home in King's Cross, which Tulip Siddiq had historically said was given to her by her parents. Now we know it was actually given to her by a businessman linked to the Awami League. Property three is a flat in Hampstead, also in North London, which Tulip lived in for several years until 2018 or thereabouts. It transpires that that was a gift as well. In this instance, the person who held the property was Tulip's sister. She had been given it by a man called Moin Ghani, who was a barrister who represented the Awami League, but who we now know was in fact gifted it himself. He didn't buy it. It was purchased by a offshore company named in the Panama Papers, in which my colleague Manu and I discovered was linked to three business people in Bangladesh.
So that property had been bought by an offshore trust, and she was living in it.
She lived in it for several years, that's right. It had been purchased by an offshore trust, gifted to a regime-linked lawyer, who then gifted it to the sister. So the point at which money changed hand was in the early noughties, when it was bought for around 250k by a company registered in the British Virgin Islands called Pedrock Ventures. And thanks to the people who produced the Panama Papers, we saw the original documentation and found that that company was linked to a firm based in Dhaka, which has boasted of its links to the government in the past and specialises in providing manpower for oil and gas projects in Bangladesh. So the fourth property is this home in Golders Green, which the mother lives in. The fifth is Tulip's own home in West Hampstead, which she was forced to apologise for not declaring she'd rented out in order to live at the first property. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm not sure I can quite remember the sixth. So
That's all right. No, that's allowed. And Gabriel, we should say that, there is no evidence at this stage that any of this has been obtained illegally. In fact, the independent advisor on ministerial standards, Sir Laurie Magnus, has said that Tulip Siddiq has not broken the ministerial code. He's looked into these houses. But for somebody who was acting as the anti-corruption minister in this Labour government, it's an uncomfortable look, isn't it, to be living at one stage in a house that was gifted and had been bought by an offshore trust. Just to explain why that becomes so problematic.
Look, I mean, in 2016, when the Panama Papers were released, those gasping with outrage and incredulity were Keir Starmer himself, Rachel Reeves, Wes Streeting, and practically any senior Labour politician whose name you could produce. And Tulip Siddiq herself, while serving in Starmer's shadow cabinet, spoke about the abuse of offshore trusts to obscure beneficial ownership. So the notion that she could be on the front bench, never mind entrusted with preventing financial crime, while failing to even give a perfunctory account of these properties and how she came to be connected to them, it was increasingly implausible by the end.
Gabriel, amid all of this, Tulip Siddiq, at different points, as you said, tried to distance herself from her aunt and her aunt's party and what was happening. You've pinned a lot of that down. You followed the trail to Bangladesh over the last week. Tell us a bit about that trip. I mean, what were you looking for and what did you find?
Well, I've got to pay credit to my editor in this respect, and I hold my hand up and say I hadn't conceived of doing this myself. He said, get out to Bangladesh, you're reporting on this story. Well, I do it from a laptop in London Bridge, so get on a plane, which is what I did. And I went there really just trying to deepen our inquiries and learn more about the regime and its practices from the people who knew it best. And through a few fortuitous conversations, I ended up not only meeting the leader of the country, but also on my last day after I'd filed my main story and essentially en route to the airport, I got to go have a look around the former residence of Hasina, which had been ransacked in the final days of her regime, which I can only say was just one of the most insane experiences of my life. You really felt generally while there that you were witnessing a post-revolutionary moment and that there's this period in history which will soon be in the rearview mirror. And no more so could you really taste that than at this residence, which is in the process of being converted into a museum. It has been cordoned off and guarded by the military since the days after the uprising last year. And so all this stuff, all this flotsam and jetsam, all these little artifacts and details are just perfectly preserved in there. When I was there, just outside the property, you could see a dental chair, a leather massage chair, these gold-rimmed pieces of furniture. And then when you went inside, you see things like certificates attesting to the authenticity of a diamond, bags from Swarovski, from Chanel. I saw some M&S socks.
That seems terribly down market.
Very, very déclassé to wear M&S socks, given everything else, exactly. I saw a couple of flyers for the Labour Party produced by Tulip Siddiq. So it was a sort of mausoleum to a regime which only half a year ago was seemingly omnipotent and unassailable.
So there, in the rubble of that regime, you find Tulip Siddiq right in the middle of it. You find a mention of the Labour Party that is now in power.
That's right.
What happens next? I mean, where does this go next?
Well, she's quit now, so I don't really know that it goes anywhere in terms of the domestic political end of this story, but there is a much wider, probably more important investigation, which is the interim government's inquiries into historic practices of siphoning money out of the country. That work will continue. So it's a kind of fascinating international political story, but unless I am mistaken, I think that the British domestic part of it, for now, in terms of Westminster, is over.
That was the Sunday Times Whitehall editor, Gabriel Pogrund, and you can read all of his reports on this story, including that remarkable dispatch from Bangladesh, online at thetimes.com. We've put a link in the episode description. The producer today was Emily Webb. The executive producers were Kate Ford and Fiona Leach. Sound design was by James Shield, and theme composition was by Mal Assetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.